Okay, great. Thank you all so much for coming and welcome to our webinar, Chemical and Environmental Hazards, an Introduction to the UK Health Security Agency's Operational Work and Research. Today, we are joined by Jim Stewart-Evans, Dr. Carrie Broom, Dr. Jolyon Medlock, and Charlotte Langdagh-Cox from the UK Health Security Agency. Today, our speakers will provide an overview of the UK Health Security Agency's, formerly Public Health England, operational work and academic research to build the evidence base. The UKHSA has an active role in the preparedness and response to chemical and environmental threats to health, working with partners to prevent and reduce people's exposures to environmental pollutants, radiological hazards, and biological agents. Underpinning research is led by health protection research units, and our speakers will summarize the priorities and current projects related to environmental public health. The natural environment and environmental public health are inseparable and will be explored in more detail in a case study of vector-borne diseases. So as always, there will be a chance for questions at the end of the presentation today. So feel free to submit those in the Q&A box, which will be at the bottom or the top of your screen. And we'll answer those or ask those for you at the end of the presentation. So thank you everyone again so much for logging on today. And I'll hand over to Jim and the team.
Thanks for the introduction. So I'm Jim Stewart-Evans. I'm an environmental scientist working for UK Health Security Agency. So we might say UKHSA when we're going through this, so that's the acronym. And in terms of what I want to cover, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, to be honest. I'd like to describe a bit of our chemical and environmental focused work and what we do day to day, and perhaps also for IES members to raise awareness of opportunities for collaboration with us and maybe even for careers in environmental public health. And this is the first of 4 presentations. So I'll try and give you a quick overview of the organisation and the day-to-day environmental work that we do. And then my colleagues will go on to tell you a bit more about research work and some of the specific projects that we're involved in. So the background to UK Health Security Agency. Of course, I've got the coronavirus there prominent in the figure. It's something I'm intimately acquainted with at the moment, for which I apologise if I go on mute and start coughing off camera. It's been good timing for putting that figure up there. But we're formerly most of us on the environmental side were part of Public Health England. So we remain an executive agency in UKHSA sponsored by Department of Health and Social Care. And although people might focus on infectious disease work and COVID, it's worth pointing out that we do have an important role as well in protecting public health, protecting people's health from chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats. So there's a wider area of work there involving chemicals, environmental, and natural hazards that I'll focus on and talk a little bit more about today. And we have a centre that specialises in radiological, chemical and environmental hazards. And on this slide, you can see some of the subject areas and some pictures illustrated and that give you a bit of an idea about our work. And what I'd say, maybe to kind of put this into a sort of wider context related to sort of IES membership and people's professional backgrounds, is that our staff typically have, certainly on the environmental side, backgrounds in environmental science and toxicology, that people's work histories before here, it's often local authority environmental health, environmental consultancy, environment agency, academia. So it's that kind of sort of broad environmental science background that a lot of us have, rather than necessarily being clinical or originating in health, if you put it that way. So we've got a fair few IES members among our staff on the environmental side. But in terms of what we actually do, health evidence, we'll talk a bit more today about some of the research generating health evidence. So we commission and undertake research ourselves, publish reports, organise CPD and training, and provide advice to government and other stakeholders. So air quality on there is maybe a good example of that. A couple of years ago, publishing a review of interventions to improve air quality and health. And there are annual conferences and stakeholder events organised to showcase the air quality research work that we're involved in, and events that are dedicated to our air quality stakeholders. That's the evidence side of it. at the bottom of that picture, you can see some pictures of incidents. I think one of them's from Buncefield, and one's a fire that was in Rutland a while back. But we provide advice on chemical hazards and public health protection during incidents. So it can range from really small scale domestic chemical exposures to things like mercury in thermometers or maybe asbestos in the home to the sort of bigger industrial chemical spills and fires. So our staff are involved in giving advice about protective actions like shelter and evacuation, decontamination, inputting to public communications as part of multi-agency responses. And we also publish information. So if you look for things like UKHSA Chemical Compendium, there's a whole load of information published on the toxicology, health standards, and incident management related to different chemical hazards. And on the emergency preparedness side, we're also part of the multi-agency local resilience forums and wider emergency planning for things like waste sites of the Environment Agency, the control of major accident hazards, high hazard chemical sites, and the exercises and emergency planning that goes on around those. We commission a service called the National Poisons Information Service that provides clinical advice on poisonings to clinicians, people in the healthcare sector. And on the wider public health side, we have environmental scientists who are on call during the day and in the evening, 24 hours, who respond to calls from emergency services and others to give advice on chemical hazards. We work on exposure reduction. I mentioned air pollution there, indoor and outdoor air pollution. There's also work involving reduction in exposure to other chemical hazards. So an example would be childhood lead, where there's a surveillance scheme and intervention programs that link blood lead results to investigation and follow-up to see whether there are environmental sources, household sources, water sources, and so on of lead. On the industrial side, we work with councils and environment agencies who might be contacted when there's concerns about particular sites. There may be public events, there may be a need to generate information for the public. We also get involved in the permitting and consultation side of things as well. And we have a team that focus on health surveillance and environmental epidemiology. So there's indicators and guidance there in terms of tracking incidents and following them up. It's a similar story in terms of extreme events and climate change. We commission and produce research, publish reports and so on, organise events. There are hot and cold weather plans. We're part of the production of those plans for the healthcare sector. There are launch events for those each year. There's alerting networks in place to improve awareness and preparedness for those particular natural hazards. And then during emergency response, in response to these events, we're part of the forecasts and alerting and cascades of information with the Met Office and others when they do occur. And on the climate change side, part of the work around mitigation and adaptation, I think in the future there'll be the next update of the health effects of climate change publication that you'll be able to find on gov.uk. And the radiological side as well, we've got a number of staff based down in Chiltern and other areas of the country that specialise in ionising and non-ionising radiation. So there's various research and operational work going on there. We're part of emergency preparedness for nuclear and other sites. We're able to model releases and their implications. If you think of things like Fukushima, potential exposures to UK nationals abroad or potential exposures of people in the UK to radiological releases like that, we've got capability to assess exposures and to base public health advice on that, as well as a similar operational advice service for emergency response to what we have for chemical hazards. There's ongoing work to reduce people's exposure to radiation. Radon's a particular example. The UK Radon website with the BGS indicates areas that have got higher radon risk, and there's active monitoring and information to the public on how to monitor and carry out interventions in the home to reduce exposure to radon. And we're also involved in regulation and consultation for permits and so on in a similar way to chemicals. We also on this side provide radiation protection advice and services in occupational settings. There's some commercial services on the radiation side as well. And I have probably gone over time a little bit with this, but I hope that gives you a quick whistle-stop tour of the chemical, environmental and natural hazard side of UKHSA and a bit about our operational work. And I'll hand over to my colleague Kerry, who'll start to tell you a bit more about our research work.
Yes, thank you very much. Just to point out the obvious mistake, it's actually the 17th of February today, but yeah, my name is Kerry Broom and I'm Knowledge Mobilisation Manager for the environmental HPRUs, which are the health protection research units. Next slide, please. So the health protection research units, which I'm going to go through as HPRUs, they're funded by the National Institute of Health Research. And over the next 5 years or so, there's a £58 million investment to protect the public from health threats. The HPRUs are partnerships between UKHSA and academia, and there are currently 15 HPRUs across 13 different topic areas. And the main research is to enhance the ability of the UKHSA to protect the public's health and minimise the health impact of emergencies. There's a strong focus in the HPRUs on collaboration and knowledge sharing, and they also play a role in maintaining the scientific expertise and future workforce within UKHSA. Next slide, please. So this slide shows the existing HPRUs for the period of 2020 to 2025, and I'm going to focus on the ones in green at the bottom. You're going to hear about the Leicester Development Award after me. Charlotte's going to talk about that, but I'm going to focus on the 3 environmental ones in green. Next slide, please. So the first one I'd like to mention is the Environmental Exposures and Health HPRU. And this is based at Imperial College in London and is a collaboration with Cambridge and King's College. And this is led by Professor Frank Kelly and Tim Gant. And you can see the website there, which once you go on the links, you'll be able to find out more information in detail about the project and the people involved. Next slide, please. So the HPRUs are normally structured around themes. This HPRU has 4. So the first one is around assessment of population exposures. Theme 2 looks at air pollution and health, looking at things across the life course and different health effects. We then have a theme looking at biomarkers of exposure and effect. And the 4th theme in this HPRU is looking at emerging environmental issues. And within this theme, we're looking at microplastics and other emerging issues. Next slide, please. So this slide summarises some of the publications that have already emerged from this HPRU. And you can see many of them are focusing on air pollution around London and human biomonitoring. Next slide, please. So the second HPRU that I'd like to discuss is the Chemical and Radiation Threats and Hazards HPRU. Again, this is linked with Imperial College in London and is a collaborative effort with Cambridge and King's. This is led by Professor Paul Elliott and Dr. Simon Bufler. Next slide, please. And here you can see the themes of research that are undergone in this HPRU. So the first one is focused on adverse outcome pathways and the relationships between exposure and response for the radiation exposures. We have a theme looking at biomarkers of exposure and the effects and susceptibility to radiation and chemical exposures. The third theme is examining integration of the in vitro data that we have with epidemiological data. And the 4th theme you can see there is around neurotoxins and high toxicity agents. Next slide, please. Again, here's an example of some of our publications that are coming out from this HPRU. And you can see many of them are focused on chemical incidents. And these are all, you'll be able to find these in the peer-reviewed literature. And there's some there on sort of radiation biomarkers. Next slide, please. And the third HPRU I'd like to mention is the environmental change in health, HPRU. And this is based at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in collaboration with University College London and the Met Office. And it's led by Professor Paul Wilkinson and Raquel Duarte-Davidson. Next slide, please. So this HPRU has 3 themes and they're listed here. So impacts and responses, response and health protection, and we have a theme on interventions and interactions, which includes health co-benefits. There's a list here of the topic areas that are covered across these themes, and many of them fit across several themes, and there's much overlap across these topic areas. But you can see here we have research being undertaken on housing and climate change. We've got indicators of how climate change can impact people, and we've got food system, agricultural changes, flooding, heat and drought, and so on. You're going to hear a bit about vector-borne disease shortly by Jolyon, but there's also research being done on air pollution interventions and the risks of climate change impacts that are outside of the UK and threats to planetary health. And I think I'm now handing over to Charlotte. Oh, no, sorry, I've missed out the publications from this one. And yeah, you can see here there's some focusing on heat, but I also wanted to point out that the HPRUs also have a responsive capacity. So there's a publication here on coronavirus seasonality and weather, and some of our colleagues in the HPRUs are able to kind of respond and react accordingly to various issues that come up. Next slide, please. Yep. Again, sorry, apologies for the date. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Welcome, everyone. Next slide, please, Jim. So thank you. As I say, my name's Charlotte. I'm an environmental public health scientist in the air quality and public health team at UK Health Security Agency. And I'm also the public and community involvement, engagement and participation co-lead in the health protection research unit I'm going to be talking about today. So our HPU is the environmental exposure and health and is based at the University of Leicester. And our research focuses on health effects from exposure in the built environment. As mentioned by Kerry, it is a developmental award and it's the first one to exist. It's a smaller HPRU than the others, but our vision is to conduct high quality, multidisciplinary applied research, which can be easily and readily translated into public and workforce health policy and clinical practice. We have 5 project areas and more details can be found on the link that's being shown. As we are not a fully funded HPRU, our page is on the Centre for Environmental Health and Sustainability at the University of Leicester. So next slide. So as I've mentioned, there are 5 project areas and these are summarized here. As I said, there's a lot more detail on the website if you want to find out any more details about it. So the first one is indoor air, and that's looking to characterize exposure and risks to health from less well-studied air pollutants near indoor environments, and that's including volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide and mold. One of the projects is focusing on measuring air quality within the home and its effect on the respiratory health and its effect on respiratory disease symptoms. And the other is measuring emissions from the desktop liquid resin bed 3D printers. It's also connected with the second project, which is the bioaerosols, which is looking to characterize the microbial exposure in the built environment and association with health outcomes. So what it's going to be doing is looking at exposure in different indoors, so that's railway stations and homes, and outdoor urban built environments, and compare with rural environments. The exposure data is going to be linked with real-time syndromic surveillance data to identify any association between specific bioaerosols and health outcomes. The third project we're working on is metals and its exposure to metals from soils and dust and assessing the potential health risks. So environmental public health surveillance has found high exposure to heavy metals such as arsenic, lead, cadmium through soil and dust. And studentships have been characterising soil and indoor dust metal contamination in England at fine resolution to allow these epidemiological assessments. They're also going to be investigating the impact of metals on bacteria and viruses. Our fourth project is water, and that's investigating the possible association between fluoride in drinking water and neurological development in children. This is based on studies that are being undertaken in other countries, and therefore this is something we're looking into. And then the final one in this HPRU is environmental noise, and that's improving the evidence base by new and updating the meta-analyses, conducting epidemiological analysis of transport noise and health outcomes, and the methodology for noise characteristics of urban green and open spaces. Each of these projects have support from knowledge mobilization, public involvement, engagement and participation, and academic career development leads. So we also have a public panel as well, and we've called them PIPET, which is Public Involvement Panel, Environment and Technology. These are actually meeting biannually, and there's opportunities to provide updates and seek their input into the work that we are doing. Obviously, if you're interested from a knowledge mobilization or stakeholder engagement, obviously, please get in touch and we'd love to talk to you. So this is a very quick update on our HPRU. As I say, we started in April 2020 and it's been funded for 5 years. So we're looking forward to disseminating the results of the research projects over the next few years. So I think I'm now handing over to Catherine.
Great. Thank you so much, Charlotte, Carrie, and Jim for those presentations. I'm just going to share Julian's presentation and then I will pass off. Perfect. Hopefully you can see that. Great. I'll pass off to you, Julian.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julian Medlock. I'm head of medical entomology in the UK Health Security Agency. I'm going to talk to you a bit about vector-borne disease risk to the UK, specifically starting off talking about mosquito related issues and then moving on to some tick related issues. So next slide, please. So quite a lot has happened in the first, second and third decade of the 21st century. If you just move on to the next slide, that's right. We've seen the invasion of invasive mosquitoes into Europe, and that's led to a new risk associated with tropical viruses being transmitted by tropical mosquitoes, such as things like chikungunya, dengue and Zika. We've also seen the emergence of West Nile virus in parts of Eastern and now Northwestern Europe, the re-emergence of dengue on Madeira. Next slide, please. And then more recently, the spread of Usutu and West Nile virus to Northwest Europe, as well as risks of Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus in Iberia. So there are plenty of risks that have emerged in the recent 20, 30 years or so. And many of these might be driven also by climate change as well as increased travel and trade. Next slide, please. So the first thing I want to mention is the threat posed by invasive mosquitoes. These are mosquitoes that have managed to travel the world by laying eggs in products that we export, things like used tires. So they've traveled from Asia to America and into Europe. And then consequently, they move around along our highway systems in vehicles and in products that we move from one country to the next. So since 1990, arrival in Italy have now spread to 28 European countries. As you can see there, they have the ability to transmit chikungunya, dengue and Zika viruses, all of which cause very similar disease, febrile illness, muscle and joint pain, but all have various complexities. You might have remembered the 2016 outbreak of Zika virus in the Americas, where it's associated with Guillain-Barré syndrome and congenital Zika syndrome. So for Europe, we don't have endemic transmission, but we have had sporadic outbreaks. The first one was in 2007 with over 300 cases of chikungunya in Italy. We then had 2,000 cases of dengue in Madeira associated with a different type of mosquito. And more recently, there have been occasional cases of these viruses, particularly in France, Spain and Italy, with 500 cases of chikungunya. Some of the work we've been doing is looking at the threats posed by this mosquito with climate change. We demonstrate that the UK has a suitable climate for the survival of this mosquito, both over winter and for a number of weeks, months of activity. And we're doing some laboratory studies looking at infection rates of these viruses within Aedes albopictus to see whether they may be more suitable in a changing climate. It's likely with climate change that the climate will be more suitable for the mosquito, and we'll see an extended activity period and potentially increased virus risk. Move on, please. So what are we doing about that? We've established surveillance at our ports since 2010. So we routinely have between 40 and 60 ports running traps, and we've also extended our network now to highway surveillance systems, mostly in the southeast of England, but now spreading up into the Midlands and in the north. And here we're looking for evidence of mosquitoes and also eggs being laid, usually from vehicles coming back from continental Europe with the mosquitoes. And we use a range of different traps. We work with the Animal Plant Health Agency, Plant Inspectorate, local authorities, and the Port Health as well. Can we move on, please? So in the last 6 years, we've detected this mosquito 6 times in the UK. Firstly, in 2016, it's on service stations on the M20 at Folkestone. Later in truck stops in Ashford, again back in Folkestone, and then in Ashford and in Hounslow Distribution Centre. There have been no detections in the last 2 years, possibly because there have been less people travelling from the continent back into the UK. We have a contingency plan that we can now trigger, working with our health protection teams and local authorities. We're looking for these eggs here in ovi traps, and once we have that, there's a programme of control around that detection site. And we have guidance also with our Chartered Institute of Environmental Health on management of invasive species. And so far, we've been able to eradicate the mosquito. But with the extended endemic zone in France, it's likely that we're going to keep seeing this mosquito coming into the country. Next slide, please. One of the other mosquito-related threats is West Nile virus. This is a flavivirus transmitted between birds by ornithophagic bird-biting mosquitoes. And then if you have a human biting or horse biting mosquito, that can then transmit the virus to humans and horses, which are dead-end hosts. We cannot infect mosquitoes. This came to prominence in the late 90s, early part of the 21st century in North America, where it was found in New York, and within the next 10 years has spread across the United States. That led to enhanced virus surveillance in Europe. And you can see here the endemic areas of West Nile virus within Europe, where there are outbreaks every year. We have between 200 and 700 cases in Europe each year. In the 2018 drought year, we had a large outbreak of over 2,000 cases. And in more recent years, there's been an expansion of West Nile virus into parts of Germany and now into Netherlands. So it's very much on our doorstep, and we're very much expecting West Nile virus to appear in the UK in the coming years. Move on, please. So some of the activities, one of the key vectors of West Nile virus is a species called Culex modestus, which we detected for the first time in 2010, and we've been monitoring its distribution ever since, understanding its ecology, working out how we can control it. It's currently established across the North Kent marshes and up the Essex coast, and seems to be dominating the mosquito catches, but actually over time it perhaps seems to be reducing numbers. So we're doing targeted surveillance for these mosquitoes. We're looking for virus in those mosquitoes. We're informing our clinical virology network, so if there are any viral encephalitis cases within the area where Culex modestus occurs and can bite humans, we may be able to detect some local cases, and then doing vector competence studies in the laboratory to see how well these mosquitoes and other species might transmit West Nile virus. This is a collaborative One Health project with our Animal and Plant Health Agency. Next slide, please. More recently, a similar virus, but far less pathogenic, the Usutu virus, is a virus that's emerged from Africa in Central Europe. It can have quite an impact upon bird populations, particularly blackbird. This was detected for the first time in some blackbirds and house sparrow in parts of London in 2020. And we've been working in a One Health capacity with colleagues within wildlife vets and also Animal Plant Health Agency to detect the virus in mosquitoes. And last year we detected 6 positive pools for this Usutu virus. This year there was only 1 positive bird so far and not found any evidence of the virus. So it may be just a one-off effect, but it's something to be mindful of. It's largely asymptomatic in humans, so we shouldn't be too concerned, but we do need to be aware that these things can evolve and develop. Next slide, please. So what do we do about this from a perspective of wetland management? There's a lot of environmental change going on in the UK. Protected wetlands can support mosquitoes, and we've done a range of research over the years to try and define which mosquitoes we have, what habitats they're in, what impact wetland creation might have, and how we could mitigate any mosquito populations or disease outbreak if we needed to in the coming years. And also what impacts drought and flooding may have. Mosquitoes do have a habit of benefiting from periods of drought and flooding. And we've developed this work as part of a NERC Wetland Life project with a number of academic colleagues. And we now have a wetland mosquito survey handbook, which you can download for free. And it's useful for wetland managers, local authorities to understand not only how to identify and monitor for mosquitoes, but what impact these mosquitoes might have on the future disease risk. Next, please. So moving on to ticks, the main tick-borne disease concern for the UK is Lyme disease. I'm going to mention a few others as well. We established a surveillance scheme back in 2005 when we were the Health Protection Agency. And over that time, we've had over 10,000 submissions from GPs, members of the public, veterinarians, wildlife charities, with more than 30,000 ticks. And we've been able to monitor sort of the distribution of Ixodes ricinus, the main tick that causes these diseases, and how that might be changing over time. We can then record from this data seasonality, and that can then input back to local authorities on tick awareness, and also whether there are new areas of the country that are now we're having reports of tick bites, which previously we haven't done. Next slide, please. You can see here, this shows some expansion of records rather than perhaps expansion of ticks, expansion of our records over the last 15 years. And we can see some areas of the country now, particularly parts of London, the southwest and southeast, we regularly get reports of ticks coming in from members of the public. And actually the southern counties of the southwest, southeast in England is probably our main endemic area for Ixodes ricinus. We get fewer records in some of the other parts of the country, maybe under recording perhaps Northern Ireland, because we've been Public Health England for the last 8 years. And now what we can do is we can identify the areas that are recently a concern and raise awareness amongst our local authorities. Next slide, please. As I mentioned Lyme disease already, it's caused by a bacteria, Borrelia burgdorferi. There are 1,500 lab confirmed cases each year in England and Wales, probably about 3,000 to 5,000 cases in total. Some of them are clinically diagnosed. But across Europe, they cause more than 65,000 cases. It's quite a complex disease in the fact that there are various genotypes of the bacteria which circulate amongst different wild animals and then transmit to humans by different stages of tick. But you can see there the main endemic area, and this is some work done by Liverpool University looking at incidence rates, is really in this southwest corner, southern counties of England. There's likely to be a number of environmental changes and climate impacts that we're going to see a shift in both tick distribution and also Lyme prevalence in the future. Next slide, please. So what we did back in 2014 was establish a collaborative project working with rangers from national parks and areas of outstanding natural beauty, where we got a snapshot survey of ticks from each of those areas and looked at infection rates. And you can see here that we had 14 to 18 areas surveyed, 22 sites for the first 6 years. We've now expanded that to include 30 national parks and AONBs and 38 sites. Highest prevalences for Lyme are in southern England. You can see there some of the areas of 10, 11%. Lowest in Wales. In fact, there's hardly any Borrelia in the ticks in Wales. And overall prevalence is just under 4%. And we can then look at genus species, and this tells us a little bit more about which wild animals might be driving the transmission cycle. Next slide, please. Taking this a step forward into one of those areas of outstanding natural beauty, this is a part of Wiltshire. We can look at how the risk varies across a landscape. So we can take different locations across a landscape, separate them out by different types of habitat, and look over a number of years. This will enable us to understand both the ecology of the disease, but also identify environmental solutions to manage the disease as well and minimize risk. So you can see tick density varies from one habitat to another and from 1 year to another. And you can see how infection rates vary there. In 2014, infection was about 3 or 4%. And by 2016, it was as high as 12, 13%. And there are many ecological drivers that are having an impact on this: small mammal populations, bird populations, climate impacting upon tree mass production. Next slide, please. One of the other concerns that we get through the tick surveillance scheme is an increasing number of reports of ticks in urban areas and in urban green space. And of course, there are greater footfall, larger numbers of people accessing these sites than perhaps some of the wilder parts of the countryside. And you might also have a population that's less aware of tick and Lyme risk. So some of the work that we've been doing as part of the HPRU work is looking at urban ticks, particularly in southern cities of Salisbury, Bath, Bristol and Southampton, trying to identify using a range of urban green space data sets within GIS and field sampling, collecting ticks, what might be driving tick densities. And you can see there that tick densities vary from one city to the next, and whether there are it's connectivity between one habitat and another. We are getting sort of infection rates similar to some of the rural areas, so up to 10, 11% in some of these urban green spaces, but generally ticks are far less common than you would find in the countryside. But then you have to think about the hazard that poses by the greater number of people. Next slide, please. Also part of the Health Protection Research Unit, we wanted to understand what other pathogens might occur in ticks. Tick-borne encephalitis virus has shown some changes in its distribution in parts of Europe because of climate change. So as part of the HPRU, we ran a study looking at using deer as sentinels for the detection of this virus, collecting deer samples from across the UK. We were able to identify high seroprevalence of tick-borne flavivirus in some parts of the country, in areas where there weren't endemic transmission of a similar virus that occurs between sheep and grouse. And that led us to identify parts of Thetford Forest and parts of Hampshire and the New Forest as potentially areas where there might be local endemic transmission of tick-borne encephalitis virus. Along with the samples, we also had samples of engorged fed ticks from these deer, which we were able to extract the virus from the sequence and show evidence that the Norfolk strain was very similar to a Norwegian strain, and the Hampshire strain very similar to a Dutch strain. We followed this up then with surveys looking for questing ticks in the environment and find infection rates extremely low, but still present nevertheless. We're now trying to understand what those drivers are and identify any other endemic foci. And so far, we've had 2 probable cases of tick-borne encephalitis virus in humans in Hampshire. Next slide, please. There are a number of other potential tick-borne disease, but I just wanted to finish off by just mentioning 2 case studies. One relates to imported Rhipicephalus ticks on traveling and adopted dogs. Many people take their dogs abroad, particularly to the Southern Europe, and also adopt dogs from parts of Southern Europe. And there's now no longer a legal requirement to control ticks on dogs when they return to the UK. And we know through the scheme that there are a number of different species that come in, and we're particularly concerned about this one species, brown dog tick. Not so much that it can transmit rickettsia, but there's no records of that so far, but it can infest people's houses and survive 18 months without a blood meal. They can live within furniture, within skirting boards and wallpapers. It's pretty unpleasant, and you really need to defumigate the house. So we try and raise awareness of this and provide advice to people traveling with their pets. Next slide, please. And the last case study I want to mention is about ticks coming in on migratory birds. Birds acquire ticks in the immature stages as they're ground feeding, both in Africa or on passage through southern Spain. And we know that there's one particular species called Hyalomma marginatum. In parts of Europe, this is a vector of a hemorrhagic fever virus called Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever virus. And we know from records that occasionally these get found on in the nymphal stage on birds at landfall sites in the UK. In the summer of 2018, it was particularly warm, and this meant that nymphs that would normally perish in the UK climate were actually able to molt through to the adult stage. And we had 2 records on a horse in Dorset and on an ornithologist working at a bird reserve in Norfolk. Both of these were negative for the virus, but we found other pathogens, rickettsia, in them. And we're doing some work with HPRU now to look and see whether increasing temperatures in the summer might lead to a greater frequency of these ticks being found in the UK with a potential disease risk. Next slide, please, my final one. So thanks for taking time to listen to some vector-borne disease work. The key things, just to remind you, are the invasive mosquitoes and future risk of local dengue and chikungunya. We're concerned about local outbreaks of West Nile virus, the increase in Lyme disease, trying to understand more about the emergence of tick-borne encephalitis virus and the non-native tick risk. But a backdrop of that really is how we're going to have an impact of land use changes and environment and climate change, which will change the landscape of vector-borne disease, and making sure we have environmental solutions to deal with that. So thanks for listening.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Julian. And thank you to our speakers in general for those presentations. I think that was very, very informative. We're going to move on to the question and answer period of this session. So if you guys have any questions from the audience, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box and I'll ask them on your behalf. But yeah, thank you again so much for the team from UKHSA for presenting today. I suppose I can kick it off with a question, if that's all right with the team. Just generally for our audience today, is there any areas of research that are kind of adjacent to what you've talked about today that might be interesting for our membership or the attendees today to look into or explore that might be underrepresented in research and projects at the moment? And that could be for any of you to answer.
I'll proffer an idea, perhaps. I mean, I think one of the things that interests me is that, I mean, looking at things like the climate change risk assessment and what risks there are ahead of us, particularly. One of the interesting things is environmental change and some of the adaptation strategies. I mentioned briefly there, and I could have gone on quite a lot longer, about how there are many land use changes we're looking at flood risk management schemes. We're looking at the Environment Bill to create landscapes that are better for biodiversity. These, potentially can have inadvertent impacts upon infectious disease. And I think trying to translate some of the adaptation strategies for health and biodiversity and flood risk management and see whether there's any sort of co-benefits there, and making sure that we have some assessments of risk and that we're mitigating those at an early phase. I think that's a really interesting area for future research.
It's a sort of similar point, I think, that I want to make. Something that occupies my mind quite a lot is that we historically perhaps tend to focus on maybe narrow health risk assessment, where it focuses on biophysical aspects rather than necessarily the bigger picture and the wider determinants of health. And I know there's a lot of interest in the links between nature and health, and looking for things that can benefit nature and people at the same time. And in some of the work that we've been doing, maybe around air pollution being one example, we've been looking at co-benefits and things like physical exercise, because sometimes there's an argument for an intervention that maybe active travel, if you're looking at cycling and walking, where there'd be some improvement to air quality, but from a public health point of view, there's a convincing reason to do it for the benefits associated with exercise. But getting across the kind of bigger picture with some of this, rather than focusing on individual hazards, and trying to present the full picture of how different hazards are affected and how the balance between nature and people as well, where maybe sometimes there's conflicts between the two. There's so much, I think, that can be done around that to move from a narrow focus to I guess maybe like a systems approach, where you're trying to look at the connections between things and weigh up what the indirect effects are in the second and third order effects. There's a lot that can be done, I think, with that.
Great, thank you both. Yeah, if you guys have any questions, please do feel free to drop them in. I think, Julian, you answered that question around ticks. Do you want to touch any more on that?
Yeah, no, I didn't go into too much depth because I had limited time, but we run a tick surveillance and mosquito surveillance scheme. So members of the public, local authorities can send samples into us. It's tick@phe.gov.uk and mosquito@phe.gov.uk. And this is actually an important part of our passive surveillance scheme. So a lot of the samples that come in for the tick scheme are coming in from members of the public or from vets or from GPs. And we're very much interested in people who are working in pest control in the local authorities. If they have a nuisance biting issue and they want some support with identifying what those are, because often once we've identified the mosquito, we can give some indication of where the habitat might be. That can often just be a report of an overwintering mosquito coming into someone's house, or it can lead to an investigation that might, we had one particular incident where nuisance biting was so bad, we were able to identify an unusual species associated with river valley flooding. And then that triggered a collaboration that led to control of the mosquito and preventing future biting. So it's certainly an important part of our work, contact with the public.
Great. Well, that's all the questions we have for now. So if anyone has any other ones, feel free to put them in. Did you guys want to add anything just before we finish off today? We might, oh, never mind. I got a question. It's a question for Charlotte, who unfortunately had to leave, but perhaps Jim or Carrie, you could maybe touch on this as well. It says, could you say a little bit more about the assessment of fungal, I'm gonna not say this right, bioaerosols in the built environment? Is this linked with changing housing standards?
Yeah, Charlotte couldn't stay online. I'm not sure what the answer is offhand, but I know that part of what's of interest with the work around indoor air quality is the relationship between energy efficiency and increasing air tightness and the knock-on effects from that. So I don't know in that work if they're focusing on air change and mold and relative humidity and so on, but I think that will be part of it. I don't know enough about the specific projects to say much more, though, I'm afraid.
Just for Paul, we could maybe get you in touch with Charlotte afterwards if you wanted to ask more around the area. I think she said she was okay with that. Great. Yeah, if there's no other questions, if you guys wanted to say any last things about the research you're doing before we end, this is your chance, I guess.
I would ask if there's anybody that's interested to find out more in terms of the actual research that's going on, or taking part, or being a stakeholder in terms of consultation and involvement. Please do get in contact with us, because there are many opportunities across all of the HPRUs to be involved. We'd love to hear from you.
Great. Well, thank you guys so much for that. That was really, really helpful. And I'm sure if anyone else has any questions later on, feel free to email myself and I can get you in contact with the right people from the organization to answer those questions. But yeah, just to close everything up, thank you again. That's it from us today. Thank you for logging in, and I hope you found that beneficial and informative. Don't forget to record your attendance today in the IES CPD tool so you make sure that it counts. And you can do this by logging into the members area of the website. As you probably know, this webinar has been recorded and will be made available both on the website and our YouTube channel, probably about a week from now. If you are watching this on YouTube, please do subscribe, hit that notification bell to be notified of new content, and like the video. And thank you again so much to Jim, Carrie, Julian, and Charlotte, who's no longer here, but thank you guys so much. It was really, really helpful. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day.